The water is dark. There are no streetlights here. No houses lining the road. No traffic. Just the black surface of the Sea of Abaco, and somewhere out there, a woman has disappeared. Her name is Lynette Hooker. She is 55 years old. And according to the man who was with her, this is what happened. Lynette fell overboard. The boat lost power. The current carried her away. And somehow, she vanished into the darkness. At first, it sounds like a terrible accident. A boating tragedy. The kind of case where investigators search the water, find nothing, and eventually have to accept that the ocean may never give the answer back. But then investigators discovered something that changed the direction of the case. A digital trail. GPS data from Brian Hooker's phone. And according to U.S. officials familiar with the investigation, that data appeared to place him somewhere he had not originally described. Suddenly, the question was no longer simply, where did Lynette go? It became, where was her husband? Because somewhere beneath the surface of this case is a timeline. And GPS doesn't care what anyone remembers. It records movement, locations, time, and sometimes it tells investigators that the story they were given doesn't quite fit. The story begins in the Bahamas, but the mystery begins much closer to home. Lynette Hooker was from Michigan. For years, she and her husband, Brian, had built a life around sailing. They documented their travels online under the name The Sailing Hookers. Their sailboat was called Soulmate. The name would become difficult to ignore, because in April 2026, the couple's shared sailing adventure would become the setting for one of the most closely watched missing person investigations in the Bahamas. Lynette and Brian were traveling through the Abaco Islands. On April 4, they were in the Hope Town and Elbow Key area. That evening, the couple reportedly took a small, approximately 8-foot dinghy. It was nighttime. Weather conditions had become difficult. And according to Brian's account, they were traveling toward their larger sailboat. Then something happened. Something that would leave investigators with no body, no eyewitness, and two very different versions of what the night may have looked like. Imagine the scene. Two people. One small boat. Open water. Darkness. And a larger sailboat waiting somewhere nearby. According to Brian's account to authorities, Lynette somehow went overboard. He said she took the boat's keys with her. Without the keys, he said, the engine could not continue running. The boat was now drifting, and Lynette was in the water. Brian eventually made his way to shore by paddling. But by the time authorities were alerted, hours had passed. Lynette was gone. For search and rescue teams, every minute mattered. They searched the area. Boats moved across the water. Authorities coordinated efforts. But Lynette was nowhere to be found. Eventually, the operation shifted from a rescue mission to a recovery effort. Only a flotation device was reportedly recovered. Lynette was still missing. And then the questions began. Why had Lynette fallen overboard? What exactly happened inside that small boat? Why couldn't Brian immediately get help? And perhaps most importantly, was the location where investigators were searching actually the place where Lynette disappeared? At first, investigators had to work with Brian's account. But they also had something else. The physical evidence. The boats. The phones. The navigation systems. And eventually, the digital timeline. Lynette's daughter, Carly Aylesworth, publicly expressed concern about the circumstances surrounding her mother's disappearance. She said she had been given limited information and wanted a full investigation. Questions about the couple's relationship also surfaced publicly. Reports referenced allegations of previous relationship problems. Those allegations have been disputed in their interpretation by Brian Hooker's attorney, who has urged people not to assume that past relationship issues explain Lynette's disappearance. Brian has consistently denied wrongdoing. That distinction matters, because suspicion is not proof, and an allegation is not a conviction. But investigators don't ignore potentially relevant history. They examine it. They test it against evidence. And in this case, the evidence was about to become much more complicated. If you're enjoying this investigation, subscribe to Mind Whisper Mysteries because every week we uncover another case that refuses to be forgotten. Because the next discovery would take investigators away from the original search area and toward a completely different part of the sea. Within days, the investigation changed dramatically. The U.S. Coast Guard opened a criminal investigation, and Bahamian authorities detained Brian Hooker for questioning. On April 8, he was arrested as a suspect based on probable cause, according to Bahamian police. But there was an important distinction. He had not been formally charged. His attorney said Brian was cooperating with investigators and categorically denied wrongdoing. Reuters. For investigators, the case now had two parallel possibilities. One possibility was tragic. Lynette had fallen overboard and the ocean had carried her away. The other was far more troubling. Something else had happened before she disappeared. But without a body, investigators needed something stronger than suspicion. They needed evidence. The sailboat soulmate was no longer simply the couple's home. It had become evidence. Investigators examined the vessel. Eventually, the U.S. Coast Guard seized it. The dinghy involved in the incident was also taken into custody and sent to the United States for forensic examination. That meant investigators could examine the boats in a controlled environment. Not just ask, "What did Brian say happened?" but, "What does the boat tell us happened?" And that distinction is everything in a modern investigation. Because people can misremember. People can lie. People can become confused. But machines often leave records. Investigators began examining location data. And then came the development that changed the search. Newly obtained GPS data from a marine navigation app on Brian's phone appeared to contradict his original account of the night. According to reporting based on officials familiar with the investigation, the phone data indicated movement into an area of the Sea of Abaco that had not previously been searched. Think about what that means. Search teams had been working from a particular understanding of where Lynette had disappeared. Now investigators had information suggesting Brian's phone had been somewhere else. Not a theory. Not a rumor. A digital location trail that investigators considered important enough to change the search. And suddenly, the ocean became much larger. Bahamian authorities approved a renewed search. This time, investigators were looking at newly identified areas. Divers went into the water. Underwater technology was deployed. Unmanned aerial systems were used. A remotely operated underwater vehicle was involved. Even a cadaver detection dog was brought in. The Coast Guard was no longer simply asking whether Lynette might have drifted away from the original location. They were investigating whether she might have disappeared somewhere else entirely. And that raises one of the biggest questions in the entire case. If the GPS data was correct, why was Brian's phone there? There was another digital detail that attracted attention. Reporting indicated that the sailboat's automatic identification system, or AIS, stopped transmitting for a period during the night Lynette disappeared and later resumed. That gap has drawn scrutiny because it overlaps with the timeframe of her disappearance. But an AIS gap alone does not prove criminal activity. There can be legitimate reasons for a vessel's tracking signal to stop transmitting. The important question for investigators is, why did it happen that night? And what was happening while the signal was absent? This is where the investigation becomes less about one piece of evidence, and more about whether multiple pieces fit together. Investigators also wanted to find another boat. A sailboat that may have been moored near the Hooker's vessel on the night Lynette disappeared. The Coast Guard publicly sought information about its owner. Why? Because investigators wanted to know whether anyone else might have seen or heard something. A witness. A light. Movement. An argument. Anything. Sometimes, in a case without a body, a single eyewitness can become the missing piece. But as of the latest public reporting, that mystery sailboat had not provided the definitive answer investigators were looking for. In early June, the Coast Guard returned to the Bahamas. They searched the newly identified areas. Divers entered the water. Underwater drones searched below the surface. Aerial systems surveyed the area. A cadaver dog assisted the operation. But Lynette was not found. On June 8, the Coast Guard announced that its mission in the Bahamas had concluded. The investigation, however, continued, U.S. Coast Guard news. And that distinction is critical. The search ended. The investigation did not. As of the latest available reporting, Lynette Hooker remains missing. Her remains have not been recovered. Brian Hooker has not been charged with a crime in connection with her disappearance. He has denied wrongdoing. And investigators have not publicly established exactly what happened to Lynette. That means this case does not have a clean ending. There is no courtroom verdict. No confession. No final piece of evidence that answers every question. Instead, there is a collection of unresolved facts. A woman disappeared. Her husband was the last known person with her. His account became the subject of scrutiny. A digital trail later appeared to conflict with parts of that account. Authorities changed the search area. The boats were seized. Specialized teams searched the water. And still, Lynette has not been found. So what happened to Lynette Hooker? Did she really fall overboard during a nighttime trip? Did difficult conditions and strong currents carry her away? Or does the GPS evidence point investigators toward a different sequence of events? At this point, no responsible documentary can answer that question with certainty. Because the investigation remains active. And because the most important piece of evidence may still be missing. Lynette herself. There is something especially haunting about disappearances at sea. On land, investigators can draw boundaries. They can search roads, buildings, fields, forests. They can return to the same places again and again. But the ocean moves. It changes. It hides. And it can turn a person's final moments into a question that lasts for years. For Lynette's family, however, this is not simply a mystery. It is a missing person. A mother. A daughter. A woman whose life existed long before the night she disappeared. And regardless of what investigators eventually determine, that life deserves to be remembered for more than the unanswered questions surrounding her final hours. The GPS data may have changed the direction of the investigation. But it has not yet provided the ending. And somewhere in the evidence, somewhere in the timeline, somewhere beneath the waters of the Bahamas, may be the answer to the question that Lynette's family has been waiting to hear. What happened to her? Until that answer is known, Lynette Hooker has not been forgotten.